It was a Tuesday afternoon when the emergency call came. The hospital was chaotic, as always, filled with the usual rush of patients with broken limbs, heart conditions, or worse. Robert had just finished consulting a patient when one of the nurses hurried over. "Dr. Williams, there's a critical case just brought in, a woman. Severe malnutrition and respiratory distress. We're taking her to surgery, but we'll need your assessment first." Robert grabbed his coat, falling into the rhythm of the moment. His mind clicked into professional mode as he moved quickly through the halls, already running through the usual possibilities. An untreated infection, perhaps pneumonia, maybe something worse. When he reached the room, the sight that greeted him was like a punch to the gut. On the gurney lay the woman he had seen so many times outside his apartment building, the same woman whose presence he had dismissed. Her face was drawn, skin tight over her bones, lips cracked, and her breathing labored. Beside her, the two little girls stood clutching each other's hands, faces pale and eyes wide. It was them, the girl who used to sit on the cold pavement outside his door, strumming a worn guitar. Robert, remember, it was a chilly morning in late fall when Robert drove the same road to the hospital, passing the same grey, weather-beaten buildings, the same tired faces of pedestrians hurrying about their business. Over the years, the sight of homeless people along the route had blended into the background of his life. They were always there, huddled under thin blankets, holding out hands for spare change. But he had grown used to looking the other way. He noticed a middle-aged woman, frail and hunched, sitting against a brick wall near the corner of his usual turn. Her eyes were hollow, her face drawn with the unmistakable signs of hardship. Next to her sat a girl, no older than 15, cradling a battered guitar in her lap. She strummed it with delicate fingers, and the tune she played, soft and melancholic, drifted through the cold air, halting Robert in his tracks for a moment. The song was hauntingly familiar. It pulled at memories he had long since buried, memories of a time when life had been lighter, simpler. His mind wandered back to his wedding day, a day that seemed lifetimes ago. The song had played softly as he and his wife, Sarah, exchanged vows. Sarah had loved that song. The weight of her absence suddenly pressed down on him, and for a moment he forgot where he was. The girl's voice brought him back to the present. Her soft, steady singing filled the space between the guitar's notes, and Robert felt an unexpected stir of emotion. It wasn't the kind of performance you expected to hear on the street, amidst the bustle of strangers and the constant rush of life. There was something raw about it, something real. Without thinking, Robert reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a few coins, and tossed them into the chipped coffee cup in front of the girl. He gave a quick, tight nod, not meeting her eyes, and resumed his walk. He didn't know why he had stopped in the first place. After all, he had seen this scene 100 times. The streets were full of people down on their luck. What made this woman and girl any different? But that song lingered in his mind long after he had turned the corner. Even as he performed his usual rounds at the hospital, it played faintly in the back of his thoughts, tugging at something deep inside him. He dismissed it, telling himself it was just nostalgia, a coincidence. Life had hardened him, made him pragmatic. You couldn't afford to get involved with every sad story that crossed your path. The next day, something unexpected happened. As Dr. Robert was pulling into his driveway after a long day at the hospital, he saw them again, the homeless woman, and this time a different girl. Younger, maybe 12 or 13. She was standing outside his gate, playing a violin. The notes from the instrument were jarring at first, but there was a strange beauty in the chaos of her music. The woman sat silently beside her, watching him with tired eyes as he got out of his car. He stood frozen for a moment, taken aback by the audacity. "What are they doing here?" he thought, his mind racing. He immediately jumped to conclusions, assuming the worst. Could this woman be using these girls to gain sympathy from passers-by? It wouldn't be the first time he'd seen such scams, children manipulated to tug at people's heartstrings, collecting money for someone else's gain. Frustration bubbled up inside Robert when he approached the homeless woman. "Look, I know what you're doing," Robert said, his voice low but firm. He fished out some money from his wallet, handing it to the woman. "Take this, but don't come here again. If I see you using these girls to beg again, I'll call the authorities." With that, he turned and walked back toward his house, the bitterness of past betrayals weighing heavily on him. Years ago, he had been swindled by someone in need, a sob story that had ended with his wallet lighter and his trust shattered. Since then, he had promised himself he wouldn't be fooled again. He couldn't afford to be. But as he closed the door behind him, something gnawed at the back of his mind. He had seen the look in that girl's eyes, fear, yes, but also something else. Innocence, no. He shook the thought away. He had done the right thing. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important. The music, the way it had stirred something long dormant in him, refused to fade. It followed him, lingering like a shadow as the night crept in. Robert hadn't seen the woman or the little girl for days now. There was a part of him that felt relieved, convinced that they had moved on, possibly to another neighborhood where their act might still be profitable. The thought crossed his mind more than once. Maybe they had been using their plight to take advantage of people's sympathy, perhaps even his. He had, after all, seen enough of those scams in the city. He forced himself not to dwell on it. Life was busy, and his work as a physician often left him with little room to focus on anything else. Still, there was a faint unease that lingered at the edges of his mind. Something about the woman's hollow eyes, her silent presence outside his building, and the child's hesitant smile had unsettled him. But Robert shrugged it off. People had their lives, their choices, and their ways of surviving. He couldn't fix everything. "She's in critical condition," the nurse's voice brought him back to reality. "We'll need to stabilize her." He turned his attention to the patient, the details of her medical condition beginning to take form in his mind. But before he could fully immerse himself in the job, the two girls tugged at his sleeve. "Please, sir," the older one, Alice, said softly. Her voice wavered, trembling with the weight of exhaustion and fear. "She's our mother. You have to help her." Her words struck him with a strange kind of clarity, sharpening the moment. He nodded, though his throat felt tight. As they worked to stabilize the woman, Robert couldn't help but feel an unfamiliar sting of guilt. He had dismissed them. He had assumed the worst, when all along they had been right there, suffering silently, just outside his door. Later, as the woman was transferred to intensive care, Robert sat down with the two girls in a quiet corner of the waiting room. Their clothes were threadbare, hands calloused, but they carried themselves with a kind of quiet dignity that made his heart ache. He asked for their names, hoping to distract them from the tension that hung in the air. "I'm Alice, and this is my sister Amber," the older girl said. Her voice, though soft, was filled with an unnatural maturity for someone so young. "Our mum, her name is Susan." She hesitated, eyes lowering as if unsure how much to say. "She used to be a singer, a real famous one, but she got sick a few years ago." Robert leaned forward, urging her gently. "Sick?" "Cancer," Alice continued. "Throat cancer. She couldn't sing any more after the surgery. Her voice, it's not the same." She swallowed hard, fighting to keep her composure. "We tried to keep things going, but she couldn't work. We had to sell the house, everything. And now Amber, the younger one, who had been silent until now, spoke up. her voice barely a whisper. "We play music in the streets to help Mum. It's all we can do." Robert felt a lump forming in his throat. The story these girls were telling him was more than tragic. It was raw, unfiltered hardship. He could picture it now. Susan, once a woman with a career, reduced to the streets by an illness she couldn't control, while her daughters scraped by, doing what little they could. "And you live?" Robert asked, already fearing the answer. "A small alleyway not far from here," Alice replied, her voice barely audible. "We stay there with Mom. It's all we have." Robert sat back, absorbing the weight of their words. The guilt pressed harder now. He had walked past them, gone about his days, while just outside, an entire life had been unraveling. Robert sat in his office, the hum of hospital machines faint in the background. His heart weighed heavily with regret, a feeling that had been gnawing at him for days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Susan's weary face, her tired eyes filled with hope and fear, and it tore him apart inside. How could he have misjudged her family? He had jumped to conclusions, thinking they were just another case, nothing special, nothing unusual. But now, as he replayed every conversation in his head, the guilt was overwhelming. He remembered the moment when Susan first walked into his office, her voice strained and weak. "Doctor," she had whispered, "I just want to sing again." But Robert had brushed her off, too caught up in his own busy schedule to really listen to what she was saying. Now, as he stared at the papers on his desk, he realized the weight of his mistake. Susan didn't just want her voice back. She needed a second chance at life. Regret twisted in his chest. He had to do something. He had to make things right, not just for Susan, but for her children too. The thought of those kids, watching their mother suffer, filled Robert with a sense of duty he hadn't felt in years. They deserved better. Susan deserved better. He couldn't undo the past, but he could change the future. Determined, Robert stood up, grabbed his coat, and headed for the hospital where Susan was staying. He needed to act fast, and time wasn't on their side anymore. When Robert arrived at Susan's hospital room, he paused outside the door for a moment. Inside, he could hear soft murmurs, probably the nurses talking to Susan. His hand hovered above the handle as he took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation that was about to take place. He opened the door, and there she was, frail, but strong in spirit. Her children sat beside her, clinging to her as if she were the only thing holding them together. And, perhaps in many ways, she was. "Mrs. Harper," Robert began, his voice softer than usual, "I've come to talk to you about your treatment." Susan looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. "Doctor? I didn't expect you," she stammered, unsure of why he was there. "I owe you an apology," Robert said, stepping closer to the bed. "I misjudged your condition, and I didn't take your concerns seriously enough. For that I am truly sorry." There was a long pause. Susan seemed to search his face for sincerity, and when she found it, her expression softened. It's okay, Doctor. I just want to be here for my kids. That's all that matters now." Robert felt his throat tighten. This was about more than medicine. It was about saving a family. "I want to help you, Susan," he said, his voice steady now. "There's a surgery we can try. It won't restore your voice, but it could save your life." The room fell silent. Susan's children, who had been listening quietly, clutched their mother's hands even tighter. The weight of Robert's words hung heavy in the air. Surgery? It was risky, especially in Susan's weakened state. But what choice did they have? Susan's lips trembled as she processed the news. "I just want to live. For them. Robert nodded, his heart swelling with a strange mixture of sorrow and resolve. "Then we'll do it," he said firmly. "We'll fight this together." From that moment on, Robert dedicated himself entirely to Susan's case. He became more than just her doctor, he became her advocate, her protector. Every morning, he checked in on her personally, overseeing every detail of her treatment. He made sure she had the best care the hospital could offer, even if it meant pulling a few strings or staying late into the night. The other doctors noticed the change in him, too. Robert, once known for being a bit detached, was now fully invested in this one patient's journey. Weeks passed, and though the road was long and hard, Susan's condition began to stabilize. Her children remained by her side every step of the way, and Robert was always there, ensuring she had the strength to keep fighting. In those quiet moments, Robert often found himself reflecting on how much had changed since he first met Susan. What began as a medical case had turned into something much deeper, an opportunity for redemption for both him and Susan. And as he watched her slowly recover, Robert knew that, in the end, he had made the right decision. The air in the hospital was thick with tension. Robert, his brow furrowed in concentration, prepared himself for the surgery that was about to change Susan's life forever. It was a delicate procedure, one that demanded every ounce of his skill, his experience, and his composure. Susan lay still, her breathing soft but heavy under the anesthesia, and Robert couldn't help but feel a sharp pang of responsibility settle deep in his chest. He knew more than anyone that this surgery was her only chance to survive. Yet the cost would be great. Her voice, the voice that once filled her daughters' hearts with warmth, would be lost forever. As the surgery began, Robert's hands moved with precision. Every movement was careful, calculated, and deliberate. The tumor, nestled deep in Susan's throat, was more aggressive than they had initially thought. Removing it was a painstaking process, but Robert was relentless. Each second stretched out, the weight of it all pressing down on him as the operating room filled with the sterile sounds of machines and quiet determination. The clock on the wall seemed to mock him, counting down the minutes, each tick a reminder of the fragility of the situation. After hours that felt like days, Robert finally excised the tumor. He took a deep breath, knowing that while Susan had survived, something irreplaceable was now gone. Her voice gone forever. The surgery had been a success, but it was a bitter-sweet victory. Outside the room, her daughters Alice and Amber waited, hearts pounding. The moment he stepped out, Robert saw the hope in their eyes, the fragile hope of a family that had been through too much already. "She made it," Robert said quietly, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Alice let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she held Amber close. But then, after a brief pause, Robert added, "But she won't be able to speak again." The weight of those words hung in the air, sinking into their hearts. Tears brimmed in Alice's eyes as she tried to reconcile the joy of her mother's survival with the loss of the voice that had comforted her for so long. Amber stood silent, her face pale as the realization set in. Their mother was alive, but the part of her they had always known, the soft, loving voice, was gone. In the days that followed, Robert made it a point to visit Susan regularly. He checked her recovery, his visits becoming more than just medical follow-ups. He'd started as just a doctor, but now something had shifted within him. He had become a part of this family's story, entwined in their pain and their hope. Every time he saw Susan, lying in her hospital bed, eyes filled with gratitude despite everything, he felt a strange connection to her and her daughters. His initial wariness of becoming emotionally involved with patients faded as he watched this family cling to each other, finding strength in their bond. Alice and Amber, though devastated by the loss of Susan's voice, never faltered in their care for their mother. When Susan finally woke, weak and unable to speak, they didn't need words. They understood her through her gestures, her eyes, and the subtle movements that conveyed her love and gratitude. They stayed by her side, holding her hands, whispering words of encouragement, as if the love they shared could somehow fill the silence that now surrounded them. And in a way, it did. Robert, watching these moments unfold, was humbled by the purity of their connection. On one particularly quiet afternoon, Robert stood by the window of Susan's room, watching Alice and Amber communicate silently with their mother. Susan's hands trembled slightly as she reached for Alice's hand, squeezing it gently. Alice smiled through her tears, and Amber placed a soft kiss on her mother's forehead. There was no need for words here, Robert realized. The love they had for each other spoke volumes, and in that moment he felt the tight grip of tension in his own chest begin to ease. He had helped them get through this in some small way. For the first time in a long time, Robert felt like he had done more than just his job. He had been a part of something much larger than a medical procedure. He had seen a family's love transcend loss and fear. The bond between Susan and her daughters was unbreakable, and in their silent strength, Robert found peace. He had doubted himself, doubted his ability to connect. But now, standing in that room, he felt like he belonged in their story. For this family, words were no longer necessary. Their love would always speak for them. The danger was over, but the difficulty in communicating with their mother made Alice and Amber even more worried and sad. One day, Amber and Alice had sat at the kitchen table for hours that night, the flickering overhead light casting shadows on their worried faces. The question hung heavy between them. How do we make this work? They both knew the answer before it was even spoken. They could only afford one tuition fee for the sign language class. "You go," Alice had insisted, her voice steady but eyes betraying the weight of her sacrifice. "You're the one who needs to be there with Mom most of the time." Amber didn't argue. She couldn't. Her heart swelled with both gratitude and guilt as Alice grabbed her guitar and left for the streets to busk again. Every day, Alice performed her heart out to crowds who hardly noticed the depth of her talent, all so they could scrape together enough for rent, food, and now sign language classes. The unspoken sacrifice was clear. Alice would work, Amber would learn, and Susan, their mother, would benefit. That was the deal. Amber walked into the sign language class the next morning, her stomach twisting with nerves. The room was small, with bright posters on the walls showing different hand gestures. She felt like an outsider, unsure of her place in this new world of silent communication. But as the instructor began, slowly showing them the basic signs, Amber's heart shifted. There was something soothing about the movements, a rhythm in the way the hands spoke without sound. Her fingers moved clumsily at first, but with each repetition she felt a deeper connection forming, not just with the signs, but with the idea that maybe, just maybe, this was the key to bringing her mother out of the prison of silence. Amber focused hard, determined to remember everything. For her, this was more than a class. It was her lifeline, her chance to help her mother communicate again after all the surgery had left behind. As she signed the alphabet for the first time, her fingers shaky, she could almost see Susan's tired, hopeful eyes light up. This was for her. Every gesture, every new word was a bridge being built. Meanwhile, Alice stood on a crowded street corner, her fingers dancing across the guitar strings. The sound echoed off the walls of the nearby buildings, But her mind wasn't on the music. It was with Amber, sitting in a classroom, learning the skills they all needed. Her heart ached with every note she played, but she kept going. She had to. The thought of their mother, sitting in silence at home, pushed her forward. She couldn't fail. Her tip jar rattled with a few coins and crumpled bills as strangers passed by. Some stopped to listen, most didn't. But it didn't matter. Every dollar helped, and every song was a step closer to a future where their mother might speak to them again, even if it was through her hands. That night, when Amber returned home, her eyes were bright with excitement. "Mum, Alice, I've got something to show you," she exclaimed as she rushed into the small living room where Susan sat, staring blankly at the television. Alice was still wiping sweat from her forehead after hours of playing. But when she saw Amber's smile, she felt a glimmer of hope spark in her chest. Amber knelt in front of Susan and carefully took her hands. "Watch this, Mom," she said softly. Then, slowly, she began signing the words she had learned that day, simple ones. "Hello. I love you. It's okay." Susan's eyes widened. For the first time in months, there was a flicker of understanding, of connection. Tears welled up in her eyes as her lips trembled. Alice watched in awe as their mother reached out a trembling hand and mimicked the sign for hello. It was shaky, imperfect, but it was a beginning. A small crack in the wall of isolation that had surrounded them since the stroke. Robert, who had been watching from the window, his breath caught in his throat. He had been watching this family for weeks now, ever since Susan's surgery was over. There was something about them, about their quiet strength and fierce love, that pulled him in. He saw Amber teaching her mother those small signs, saw the way Alice hovered nearby, her fingers still slightly trembling from her performance, and felt something stir inside him. These girls were fighting with everything they had, and for what? For their mother's smile. For her to speak to them again, even if it wasn't with words. As he watched, Robert felt a tug in his chest, a pull towards their struggle, and with every passing day, his curiosity and something else, something deeper, grew. Robert decided to accompany them on the upcoming journey. Susan sat quietly by the window, her hands resting on her lap, feeling the sunlight streaming through the sheer curtains. It had been years since she last sang. The melodies that once filled her home were now just echoes in her mind, but her love for music, that deep, soul-stirring passion, had never left her. And today she realized something. She didn't have to give it up entirely. There was a way to bring music back into her life through sign language. Music, she thought, wasn't just about sound. It was about emotion, rhythm, and expression. It was something that could be felt, even if it couldn't be heard. And sign language, with its graceful gestures and expressive movements, could be the perfect medium to convey that. She had learned American Sign Language with her youngest daughter. At first, it had been a tool for communication, a bridge between her daughters and her silent world. But now Susan realized it could be so much more. She imagined herself standing on a stage, her hands moving fluidly through the air, interpreting not just the words of a song, but its very essence. Each sign would carry the weight of a note, the rise and fall of a melody, the surge of emotion that music could bring. The community of people who couldn't hear the music could see it, feel it, in the rhythm of her hands, the expressions on her face, the movement of her body. "Are you sure about this?" Alice asked as they sat around the dinner table that evening. "It's a big commitment." Susan smiled softly, her fingers already tracing the signs for hope and dream in the air. "I'm more than sure. This is what I need to do, not just for me, but for everyone who thinks they can't experience the magic of music." Her daughters exchanged a look, but didn't argue. They could see the determination in their mother's eyes. It had been years since Susan had shown such passion for anything, and they weren't about to dampen her enthusiasm. "We'll help you," her youngest daughter Amber said. "I can't believe I didn't think of it sooner. Sign language and music, what a perfect combination." And so the dream began to take shape. Susan spent hours in front of the mirror, practicing how to translate the rhythm and beat of songs into sign language. She experimented with different genres, from classical to pop, figuring out how to capture the energy of a fast-paced song or the slow, aching melody of a ballad. Her hands moved gracefully, her face reflecting the emotion of each piece. The community began to take notice. Word spread about Susan's project, and soon she was invited to perform at a concert, a collaboration with a famous singer who had heard about her idea. Susan's hands trembled slightly as she stood backstage, waiting for her cue. She had never felt so nervous before, not even when she had performed piano recitals in front of hundreds of people. This was different. This was her new beginning. The lights dimmed, and the first few notes of the song floated through the air. Susan stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. As the music played, her hands began to move, translating the lyrics into sign language with a fluidity that felt almost magical. The crowd watched in awe, many of them from the deaf community, their eyes fixed on her every gesture. By the end of the performance, the audience erupted in applause, those who could clap, and those who showed their appreciation by waving their hands in the air, a visual gesture of applause in the deaf community. Susan stood there, overwhelmed by the response. She had done it. She had found a way to share music with those who couldn't hear it, and in doing so, she had found a new purpose for herself. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of interviews and invitations. The deaf community had embraced her wholeheartedly, inspired by her passion and creativity. They saw in her not just a musician, but an advocate, a woman who was using her skills to bridge two worlds. Back at home, as she sat with her daughters, Susan felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known in years. She had thought her days of making music were over, but she had discovered something even more profound. Music, she realized, wasn't about sound. It was about connection, about finding a way to express what was in the heart. And now, with sign language as her instrument, she was ready to keep playing. Susan's life had taken an unexpected turn, one she never anticipated but fully embraced. After years of living quietly in the shadow of others, her newfound role in the world of music and sign language had begun to shift her entire existence. She had always been content, or at least she thought so, playing a supporting role in her daughters. But now the light was shining on her, and with it came opportunities she had never imagined. The invitations started pouring in almost immediately after that first performance. At first, it was small gatherings and a few local gigs here and there, but soon it grew. People were talking. Susan became a name, a presence in both the music world and within the deaf community. Her performances were not just about the music, but about connecting, truly connecting with people who had long felt left out of such experiences. The joy she brought to them brought new joy into her own life. Did you see her? She doesn't just interpret the music. She feels it. One of the attendees had whispered after a show, their words spreading through the crowd like wildfire. And they were right. Susan did feel the music, every beat, every note, every lyric. And she poured that feeling into her signs, each gesture alive with the rhythm of the song, with the emotion of the singer. Her role in the community began to expand, and so did her performances. Larger venues reached out, asking for her to join their shows. Musicians wanted her on stage with them, translating their art into a language that could touch more souls than ever before. Susan felt herself soaring higher, her confidence growing with every performance. She wasn't just an interpreter anymore, she was an artist in her own right. But it wasn't enough just to perform. Susan wanted to do more. It wasn't long before she, along with her sister and niece, came up with an idea. They decided to launch a new project that would combine music and sign language in a way that hadn't been done before. Their goal was ambitious: to create a program that would teach both hearing and deaf communities how to engage with music through sign language. It was a passion project for all of them, but especially for Susan. The project started small, just a handful of classes, but word spread quickly. People were intrigued, musicians were excited, and the deaf community was enthusiastic. For the first time, music wasn't just something that happened around them, it was something they could truly participate in. And it wasn't long before the music industry began to take notice, too. What they were doing was groundbreaking, and the interest from both hearing and non-hearing grew at an unprecedented rate. "We never imagined it would grow this fast," Amber had said one evening, breathless from the rush of organizing their next event. But Susan had known. Deep down, she had felt it all along. There was a hunger for connection, a need to break down the barriers between the hearing and deaf worlds. And what they were doing was more than just teaching. They were building bridges that could change the way people experienced music forever. As their influence expanded, so did Susan's role. People began to look to her not just as a performer, but as a leader, a mentor. She was no longer just interpreting the songs of others. She was guiding others to do the same. Susan started mentoring young sign language interpreters, helping them to find their own unique ways to express themselves through the art of music interpretation. For many of them, it was the first time they had seen someone in this field who made them believe they could truly change things. Susan had once thought her life would be quiet, simple, unremarkable, but now she knew that the future was far brighter than she ever could have imagined. Every day, she woke up excited for what was to come. She had found her purpose, and with it, a joy that filled her entire being. The world was listening both with their ears and their eyes, and for Susan, that was enough. Finally, she had found a way to make music a language everyone could understand. And in doing so, she had found herself. Susan sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing slow, deliberate patterns on the surface. The sun spilled through the window, bathing the room in a soft, golden light. But Susan barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, caught between excitement and a deep-seated nervousness. She had just received the news, a message that could change everything. Alice, her eldest daughter, burst through the doorway, her face lit up with excitement. "Mom, you're not going to believe it," she signed enthusiastically. "Lucia Maravilla wants you to perform with her." At the mention of the famous singer's name, Susan's heart skipped a beat. Lucia Maravilla, an international sensation, a singer whose voice could touch souls. And now, Susan, who had never spoken a word in her life, would be sharing the stage with her. But this wasn't just about a concert. It was about breaking boundaries. Susan's hands would speak what her voice never could. She blinked, the enormity of it settling in. Her second daughter, Amber, noticed her mother's hesitation and came closer, gently taking Susan's hand in hers. "Mom, you've got this. You've worked so hard for this moment," Amber signed with a steady, reassuring smile. Susan nodded slowly, her chest tight with emotion. It wasn't just a regular performance. This was history in the making of a concert where sound and silence would unite. For someone like Susan, who communicated entirely through sign language, it was more than an opportunity. It was her chance to show the world that music didn't belong solely to those who could hear it. In the weeks leading up to the concert, the house buzzed with activity. Susan and her two daughters worked tirelessly, preparing for every aspect of the performance. Every evening they gathered in the living room, papers scattered everywhere, music sheets, sign language notes, and choreography. "You're going to be amazing, Mum," Alice signed one night, her eyes bright with pride. Amber, sitting next to her, nodded in agreement. "We've got your back." Susan smiled softly, grateful for their unwavering support. She had taught them both sign language when they were still toddlers, and now they were her greatest allies, helping her practice each sign with precision. Susan's hands moved fluidly, each gesture carefully timed to match the rhythm of the music they would perform. Amber watched her mother closely. "I can't wait for everyone to see what you can do," she signed. "They're going to feel the music through you." Susan's heart swelled. It wasn't just about performing alongside Lucia Maravilla. It was about showing the world that music could transcend sound. For Susan, it was about emotion, connection, and the beauty of silence. The night of the concert arrived, and the energy in the auditorium was electric. The seats were filled with people from all walks of life, hearing and non-hearing alike, all eagerly awaiting the unique performance. Backstage, Susan's heart raced, her hands trembling slightly as she took a deep breath. Alice and Amber stood beside her, their expressions calm and encouraging. Alice gently squeezed her mother's hand. "You've got this, Mom," she signed. "We're right here with you." Susan nodded, trying to calm the flurry of nerves in her stomach. As Lucia Maravilla's voice filled the auditorium, a powerful melody that seemed to vibrate through the very walls, Susan knew it was time. She stepped forward, her daughters by her side, as the spotlight found them. The audience hushed as Susan raised her hands, her movements smooth and graceful, signing the lyrics with precision. She could feel the music through the vibrations beneath her feet, every note translating into fluid motions. The crowd was mesmerized. Those who could hear were swept up in Lucia's voice, while the deaf audience followed every motion of Susan's hands, understanding the song through her. It was a performance unlike any other. For the first time, sound and silence danced together on the same stage, showing that music wasn't limited to one sense. It was an experience that could be felt in the heart. The harmony between Lucia's voice and Susan's signs created something truly magical. Robert sat in the audience, his eyes fixed on the stage. Many years after that fateful meeting, he still accompanies and helps Susan's family. And now, watching Susan perform, watching their daughters help bring the performance to life, stirred something in him. "She did it," he whispered to himself. "She really did it." The concert ended with thunderous applause, the audience rising to their feet. For the deaf members of the audience, hands waved in the air, a silent ovation that carried as much weight as the roaring cheers. Susan stood on the stage, tears in her eyes, knowing that this night had changed everything. Her daughters stood beside her, equally emotional, as they embraced their mother, proud of the history they had just made. For Susan, this concert was more than just a performance. It was proof that the language of music wasn't confined to sound. It was something that could be felt, seen, and experienced by all. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of their new apartment, casting a soft amber glow over the living room. Their new apartment was humble, just 2 rooms and a small kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was more than they had ever dreamed of having. Robert had helped them find it. He always seemed to show up when he was needed the most. "He really came through for us," Alice said, looking around at the sparse but comfortable space. Amber smiled. "Yeah, this place. It's cozy." As they sat in the fading light of their new home, they both silently reflected on their journey. For Susan, it had been a lifetime of struggle, one hurdle after another. but somehow she always found a way through. Her daughters had been right beside her for most of it. And now, here they were. "Do you think things will get better from here?" her daughter asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Susan smiled, a small smile, and nodded. It wasn't the kind of sugary reassurance that adults sometimes give children, the kind they don't really believe in themselves. It was honest. They had a roof over their heads, 4 walls to call their own, and each other. That was enough to call it better. For years, Susan had worked as a sign language interpreter, helping people communicate in ways that words alone couldn't capture. Music had always been her passion, but through her work, she found something equally beautiful. Whether it was bridging the gap between people with different abilities or using music to connect with strangers on the street, Susan understood the power of communication. The future was still uncertain, as it always had been, but now it seemed a little less daunting. Together, they had weathered every storm life had thrown at them. And in that moment, sitting side by side, they knew that no matter what the future held, they had the strength to face it together. Thank you all for following along with the emotional journey of Susan and her daughter. It's been a long, tough road, but one filled with hope as they overcame great challenges and found the light at the end of the tunnel. This isn't just a story of survival, but also of love, perseverance, and the strength of family bonds. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with your friends and loved ones. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring stories. Thank you for always supporting and being with us on this journey. See you in the next video.